He's coming to London.
Yeah, you
Yeah, I didn't know when we talked about it.
Yeah. So welcome to the NEST Distinguished Speaker Series. And just before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Anapawak, and Chinooka nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and the mistakes of the past and to consider how we can each, in our own way, try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And now I ask Martin to introduce our distinguished speaker for today. Over to you.
Thanks, Vicki. All right, thanks everybody for coming. And I'm very happy today to welcome Dr. Jason Hackworth as our next distinguished speaker. Dr. Hackworth is a professor of planning and geography at the University of Toronto. He's written 3 books and a number of articles, many articles, on the role of economics, race, and policy in shaping North American cities. Among other things, as many of you probably know, he's widely recognized as a leading scholar of gentrification in North American cities. And recently, he's been at the forefront of researching connections between racism, conservatism, and population decline in old American industrial cities. And today he's going to speak about the role of race and racism in Canadian cities in the context of these broader comparative debates that we've had for many years about the differences between cities in Canada and the United States. He's going to speak for about 45, 50 minutes or so, after which we'll have some time for questions and discussion. So let's all give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Martin, and anybody else who was involved in inviting me to come speak here. I very much appreciate the opportunity. I've always admired this institution, and particularly the units that are connected most with my research, political science, history, sociology, and of course geography. I'm always stunned by the productivity of folks here at this university. I'm super glad I don't have to compete with you all in the annual review because it's just sort of stunning levels of production and also just sort of influence, I think. So thank you for the opportunity to come meet with you and discuss this issue. And I thought I might give a little bit of background about my sort of personal kind of story because it sort of relates in some ways to sort of my intellectual arc that I want to talk about here today. So I'm originally from the States. I grew up in Ohio, but lived in Canada for 22 years and intend to live my remaining years here. The US kind of scares me, to be honest, even though that's where I'm from. But I'm very much here when I use the pronoun we, I mean Canadian, Canada. We're talking about Canadian urban studies. And I'm an urban studies scholar, and much of my work, even since coming to Canada 22 years ago, is comparative, right? It's comparative sometimes between the two countries, or certainly Europe and Toronto, sometimes within the countries, sort of Cleveland and Detroit, Toronto, Montreal. Sometimes it's just about an issue, a case study, or an issue that is, a case study with an implied comparison in the backdrop. And what I want to do is sort of tease a bit of that out, sort of like when it comes to race and racism. I thought a jumping off point, it's a bit of a dated jumping off point, but it's a jumping off point, was a book that was written by 2 geographers a little over 40 years ago called The Myth of the North American City. And they really, these 2 authors, it's a really good book actually, by the way, I don't mean to denigrate, and certainly anything I'm about to say is just sort of, it's very good, it's been reprinted in a variety of contexts, written by Michael Goldberg and John Mercer. And they very much sought to draw contrast, right? Contrast and sort of dispel this notion that there is as kind of a uniform kind of North American city that we can kind of generalize from, that there's variation, and the variation that they sought to point out was between Canadian and American cities. And one theme, only one theme, in that book, there's a lot of themes that they touch on. One theme was sort of the level of racial tolerance, the racial tolerance in between the 2 societies, and really sought to emphasize, in this particular case, the distinction, or the sort of what they saw as a much more of a tolerant society in Canada than in the United States, and they sought to sort of use that as a sort of vehicle to explain that. Explains quite a bit of the variation between the two countries, and it's been debated in a variety of different circles. I'm going to sort of zero in on that today because it's something that I too have been writing about in recent years, and that is the sort of the impacts of the sort of the prevalence, the intensity, the types of ethno-racial discrimination, particularly but not exclusively in housing markets, where it occurs, where it doesn't, and to sort of to try to understand whether we can kind of look at this and whether there are ways that we can sort of depart from this kind of broad paradigmatic model sense without sort of diminishing the stories of those who are face discrimination. A couple of qualifying points, I said preliminary qualifying points. I would say, first of all, that I do want to be sensitive to talking about race and racism is difficult, and I hope I don't offend any sensibilities here. But my own motivation comes from the belief that we should face that discomfort in some sense, and to listen, in particular to those who claim differential treatment, particularly in societies like ours that is devoted, at least in principle, to concepts of equality. And second, and related to that, is that much of what I'm going to talk about is also an auto-critique. So I'll talk about some conceptual issues, but I want to talk about a couple of studies that I've done in recent years that really do try to sort of tease out this comparison when it comes to the issue of particularly anti-black racism, although sort of could be perhaps broadened to other forms of racism as well. Okay, so the first kind of element, conceptual point I want to start with is just the idea of using conceptual, urban models in general. And, the first, I suppose, question, and it has been asked by a number of different geographers, sociologists, and others, is why do we even use these sort of broad paradigmatic models to begin with, in Chicago School, North American City, why do we do these sorts of things? And I suppose to just sort of start, there is, the idea, anyway, the value of these, of using models of this sort is that, they create a reference point, right? They create a reference point, a set of researchable generalizations, a baseline from which to compare and contrast. And so even if we use a sort of a notion of sort of North American city or global city, or just sort of this model, doesn't mean we have to sort of find all those same elements in the cities that we study, but it creates a kind of a reference point. There are lots and lots of critiques, though, that have flowed, not just the book that I want to talk a bit about today, but of urban models in general. And I think that most of them flow from the idea that they don't recognize historical or geographical or institutional particularisms. That is, things that could only occur because of a particular time, a particular place, or have a certain institutional thumbprint that is not replicated elsewhere, and therefore makes it sort of like a kind of sloppy way to do research, or sort of an overly deductive form of research in doing this. And the myth of the North American city is only one of several kind of prominent examples of sociologists or geographers trying to challenge urban models. So in that case of the myth of the North American city, these two authors were seeking to dispel the notion that, Canada and the United States are essentially the same thing, or that was sort of the sort of paradigm or the sort of stereotype. And then they sought through a variety of different empirical and theoretical mechanisms, or mostly empirical, to sort of suggest that no, there's a number of policy differences, there's a number of differences when it comes to governance, and these are measurable differences. And one of those had to do with racial tolerance. They primarily based the differences in racial tolerance, like other studies like Lipset and more popular work like Michael Adams, on sort of national level tolerance surveys, sort of like, they sought to sort of distinguish and to sort of set up the notion that there is a distinctly more, there's a difference between Canadian and American cities in this. And it's been, I don't know if anyone's looked at the citation count, very influential, and we were just having a brief conversation about it. Political science, geography, probably sociology to a certain extent. This book and the various reprints of chapters have really made the rounds over the years. It's not the only one, right? Maybe the most famous one in sociology was sort of the various efforts to sort of critique the Chicago School. The Chicago School embodied, in part with this map, the Burgess map, but in a variety of different other applications and critiques, basically that sought to say that this period of time, the Chicago School being this kind of period of sociologists in the 1920s and 1930s seeking to explain primarily processes of immigration and assimilation and both spatial and sort of social within the city of Chicago, that everything from the shape of this model to the mechanics of that process to whether that happens at all, to whether it even happens in Chicago, right, have been sort of arguments that have been waged at sort of dispelling this, right, like dispelling this notion that we can learn so much from this, or that everything, that this is the appropriate reference point. And then maybe most recently, I know the geographers are probably in the room, may recognize the name Jenny Robinson, who has been writing about global cities and this notion that we, particularly those who write about the global south, I'm not in that camp, but those who do write the global south are overly reliant on models that are developed in the global north, particularly global cities. So we're sort of seeking models when we're studying cities in sub-Saharan Africa, models that were developed in London and Toronto and New York, and this sort of guides the assumptions of what kinds of data to gather, what sorts of questions to ask, and that this is wholly inappropriate, that we should just start anew and sort of develop at a minimum models from the global south outward, but that this is sort of inappropriate to use that particular model of the global city to see how that sort of does or does not vary. So the long and the short of it, right, is that there's there's a number of very worthwhile attempts to challenge various models, right, various models and how they're used in urban studies. Some have suggested that we can have a similar argument, or we can have it take a similar arc when it comes to the American experience of anti-blackness in cities, and that this is so particular that we can't sort of apply this in any other sense. And I would say that particularly in Canadian urban studies, this is the looming large, this is understandable, this tiny country next to this colossus, that media, the size of the academy, there's lots of reasons, and the sort of superficial similarities between the two societies. It's very understandable why that would be the case, why there's a constant sort of backdrop of sort of how similar Toronto is, for example, to other cities or cities elsewhere in North America or other cities in Canada. But I do think that there's a number of problems, at least in sort of the attempt to sort of other or to use the U.S. as a foil when it comes to anti-black racism, that it sort of blinds us in some ways to some of the things that happen here in Canada. So before getting to that, I would say that it really should be, for those of you who aren't urban studies scholars and who don't sort of pay attention as much to as I do, just sort of like as obsessed with American politics or urban studies, with the amount of the importance of anti-black racism as a force in understanding American cities. It's really difficult to summarize or overstate, really, to be honest, the impact that urban studies scholarship, the role that anti-black racism has played in a variety of different forces shaping the pattern or process of American cities. And this is just sort of a selection of books, and my own included, just sort of that I very much consider myself in that paradigm of emphasizing this as a systemic role. It's not just sort of like something that happens in addition to capitalism or something that happens in addition to all of the processes. It is centered, right, in these, and centered in a variety of different ways. Famous books like the American Apartheid book by Doug Massey and Nancy Denton, which really was a sort of a kind of a synthesis of a variety of different studies and metrics, arguing how particularly black-white segregation, black-white structuring of cities, structures, political access structures, material access, and is among the most influential forces in American cities. This book has been cited hundreds of, thousands of times, I'm sure. Urban political theorists like Clarence Stone, who I know Martin has written with, that writing about how black political coalitions or ethno-racial political coalitions have basically fundamentally shaped the American urban political atmosphere, and how, in particular, sort of the kind of rejection or sort of contest of white citizens and white groups to black political coalitions, in particular, have very much shaped in a variety of different ways. My own book came out 4 years ago, which was just sort of trying to emphasize the role that anti-blackness has, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, at kind of structuring or generating what we think of as urban decline, and what we think of and mostly just sort of dismiss as just sort of the product of manufacturing job loss is actually, as much as anything, the product of anti-blackness. And then a number of different other books, popular and academic, that just sort of seek to emphasize it. So the long and the short of it is this is a foundational, paradigmatic concept, anti-blackness, anti-black racism in American cities in a variety of different modalities and applications that is crucial, right? Like is a crucial role. Until the last 20 or so years, I would say we'll use Group Canada as a broader category of a sort of non-American global north. The forces, particularly of anti-blackness, but sort of racism in general, I think have not been given the same kind of level of attention, right? I think that maybe is fair to say. And really in the last 20 years, I think there's been an effort, noted effort in geography and sociology to try to do this. Maybe not by sort of saying that something happened in New York in 1945 is automatically replicating itself in Paris in 2024, but maybe to sort of use some of the studies, the metrics, that sort of approaches, data sets, assumptions that have long been used in the kind of American urban studies world to other societies. And I guess my jumping off point I want to sort of ask is it, can we do this, right? Can we do this? Is there what are the limitations to understanding anti-Blackness outside of the American, especially if we're deriving our methods, our theories, our ideas from this corpus that is just difficult to avoid, right? Even if we wanted to avoid it, it's there, it's so in depth, and how would we do that if we did? It's certainly not unique to Canada. There's lots of scholars who are writing about much of Western Europe, New Zealand, other parts of the global north that are not the United States. Different views about this, right? Maybe the most extreme that I've read is basically absolutely not. That you cannot do this, that American racism, particularly anti-Black racism, is such a particularistic thing that you can't even imagine doing this. I mean, it's sort of, I don't know how many sociologists, recognize the names, Pierre Bourdieu and Louis Kant, wrote this about 25 years ago, and it's got a lot of attention, much of it admittedly negative. It sort of was an essay, and it was not aimed at Canada, it was being aimed at France and Brazil. Those are the two societies that they emphasized the most with this particular essay, and that their basic argument was that, like, as expressed here, is that there's just nothing comparable to American anti-Blackness in its rigidity and its sort of its scope, and so it's inappropriate. It's such a particularism that it's inappropriate to sort of apply this, and not only is it inappropriate, they suggested it was a form of cultural imperialism. Basically, the idea of sort of looking at racism in France was therefore some kind of like a form of cultural imperialism, similar to, putting McDonald's in Paris or something, that it's just sort of, it's that over the top. And of course, in fairness, there have been a number of critiques of this. This is not sort of like, this is what I would say is maybe the most, the sort of most kind of spurious, I would say, sort of conclusion of this sort, but others, I think, have tried to sort of suggest similar things. I would submit that the Canadian urban studies world does, at least part of it anyway, does this in its own way, using the United States as a foil. Again, I want to make a couple caveat points. There's no generalization. There's, of course, a number of scholars. I think of Jim Darden, Joseph Mensa. There's a variety of folks that are trying to, and have been trying to for decades, emphasize these themes in Canadian urban studies. I don't want to suggest that there are no exceptions to these, but I am trying to suggest that in mainstream urban geography textbooks, urban sociology textbooks, and mainstream journals, that there are a number of tropes, foils, whatever we want to call them, that are used that specifically invoking the spectra of anti-Blackness in the United States as a way to dismiss or diminish its importance in various Canadian locales. And I'm creating this topology. I don't know how well it changes virtually every time I look at it, so we'll see how well I can sort of describe this now. But I would say that I don't know of an example, which is the other kind of preliminary point to this, I don't know of an example which is as sort of strongly stated as Bourdieu or Kant, in the sense of like absolutely not. This is something. But there are a number of subtle ways that I think I will call them fallacies, in a sense, that sort of rest on sort of partial truths or incomplete truths that I think that sort of have the effect of kind of discouraging or sort of distracting from a focus that I believe we ought to have, at least in housing markets and other applications. Okay, so each of these, I'll call the first one the institutional specificity fallacy. And the basic idea here is to sort of like, emphasize the institutional particular characteristics of something occurring in the United States, find its absence in Canada, and therefore conclude the larger process is not there. And I think maybe the most common example, or the best example I can think of in the literature that I know, is sort of, there's been a number who have emphasized that, so in the mid-20th century, the Federal Housing Administration in the United States explicitly mandated that in exchange for construction loans, and this was mainly the way that housing got built in the 1940s and before, was through these federal entities that directly lent money to developers, right? Developers who would use it for the construction loan, then they would either rent it out or sell it afterwards. It was mandated by the Federal Housing Administration that exchange for this, they had to keep full segregation. So it had to be a white only or black and other only development, and that there had to be oftentimes really intricate efforts at sort of separating into the 1940s and 1950s. Some Canadian scholars have looked at this and said, like, we have Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, didn't have this language in it, so therefore redlining didn't exist in Canada. And there's always a, yes, that's true. There was no sort of explicit language to this sort, but it's also just very incomplete to sort of make that such a broad conclusion. First of all, we don't know because we don't gather data in Canada on mortgage redlining in the same way that the Americans do. So we really don't have a sense. And that particular form, the FHA form, was only one of many particular forms. And there were other more pervasive forms, direct banker mortgage insurer discrimination. We have no idea about that. So identifying the institutional specificity and arguing that it doesn't exist elsewhere. The second, again, there are other ways of denying racism, but this is, I would say, these all sort of depend on sort of using that spectrum of the United States. If there's others that could be, these are ones that are sort of explicitly that I've sort of come across in my readings, and particularly things that I would sort of say mainstream, like textbooks and that sort of thing. The differential intent fallacy, which is the idea of sort of caricaturing racist actions in the United States, unequivocally racist actions in the United States, and then whitewashing their intent of almost the exact same action in Canada. And so I think immigration policy is a good example. I've seen it written, of course, the American urban policy it wasn't just urban, it was just sort of the immigration policy from the mid-1920s into the 1960s explicitly kept ethno-racial kind of stasis by sort of limiting immigration to groups that were already in the country, or the ratios in the country. We have a similar form here, but the way that this is often described, so I've seen written, for example, that Canada favored British Isles immigration at the expense of immigrants from elsewhere in the world, but it wasn't racist like it was in the United States. That's the paraphrase version. In Canada, it was just as those immigrants would fit in better and already had relatives living in Canada, which is the exact same thing that was said by the Americans during the mid-20th century. So the differential intent fallacy is sort of like, okay, that happened here too, but it was for different reasons. The assertive ignorance fallacy, which is sort of the notion that, maybe the paraphrase version is that sort of like emphasizing these connections between really awful things in the United States and their sort of contemporary outgrowth, and either not knowing or not being concerned with the fact that many of those precedent points happened in Canada as well. So, a paraphrase version of this might be something like, the United States had redlining, restrictive covenants, slavery, sundown towns. So that's why we need to focus on anti-black racism there, without either mentioning, or in some cases knowing that Canada had all those things until very recently, and in some cases after they expired in the United States. So I would say this is maybe more common in popular culture than in academia, but I do think in academia it is very common in urban studies to just simply discuss those forms of oppression in the United States and then just stop without going further in the Canadian context. The fourth is the evidence lacking fallacy. This is one I think that maybe we can actually address. Some of these are sort of more logical conundrums more than they are sort of data. But this is sort of the notion that sort of because evidence doesn't exist for particular forms, redlining, housing discrimination, that we could just sort of assume it doesn't happen here. And there, so something like a paraphrase version might be something like there's no evidence of widespread housing discrimination or redlining in Canada. And there's a certain kernel of truth to that, primarily because we don't gather data. That what we know about mortgage redlining and discrimination in the United States, we know through something called the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, because it requires bankers to record the ethno-racial or self-stated ethno-racial identity of applicants, and they can be compared, based on a number of different criteria, their credit, and all these sorts of things. And they find that there's still considerable anti-black racism in the direct provision of mortgages in the United States. We don't have that evidence. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means it was a terrible fight to even get that form in the United States. I don't know that we can make that conclusion. There are other forms that I think are also where we sort of have a data-rich environment and one environment we just sort of assume we don't need that in this. And maybe the best example are housing audits. For sociologists in Riverway know housing audits very well. I'd say that's probably the world, maybe in legal studies, where they're used most frequently. But housing audit, the best examples of housing audits or audits in general, are essentially where you hire two actors, and sometimes a black actor and a white actor, sometimes you multi-ethnic and you ask them to apply for a mortgage, try to rent an apartment, buy a car, whatever, and you record differential rates of response. Who gets called back the most for the job interview, who gets what interest rate when it comes to the mortgage, and there are hundreds of these that have been done really throughout the world, including here in Canada. There have been a number that have been done. I don't know of a single one that shows anything other than anti-black racism. Right? That there is a form it's a very compelling form of evidence. The problem is we don't. Again, part of these are funded by the U.S. Housing and Urban Development Department in the United States. The CMHC has not shown great interest, I would say, in doing this sort of thing. That they're systematic. They're very difficult for individual researchers to set up. We're trying to set up a few right now at the University of Toronto. They're very difficult to execute without live paired audits. There are some of us trying, but they're very, very difficult. And what I think is where the real evidence is lacking is that there is not a systematic effort at the sort of state level, government state, to gather information. So there is quite a bit of sort of like assertive evidence lacking that can be asserted, right? That sort of we don't have evidence to this extent. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it does mean that we don't have evidence of it, and I think that itself is a challenge. The isolated incident fallacy, again, the kernel of truth to this, the idea being that sort of like, you look at that broad spectrum of things that I talked about before, just the incredible depravity of anti-black racism in housing and in politics, and then say that, okay, sure, things like Africville that occurred, things that there was this or that occurred in Canada, but we didn't really have the same systemic anti-blackness at sort of its scale as they did in the United States. And again, there's a kernel of truth to that, but not for maybe the reasons that we want to sort of hope for, and that is that there was an effort, a systemic effort up until 1967 to deny access to the country to virtually all non-white people, including black people. And so there weren't that many black majority neighborhoods in the entire, outside of Nova Scotia, in the entire country. And so, yes, looking at this kind of like isolated incident, yes, it is more isolated, perhaps, but not necessarily for the reasons that we might want to hope for. And I would say that I think all of these come from a decent place. I think they come from an aspirational place of hoping that they don't exist in Canada. I believe, though, that we should be a bit more serious about sort of assessing them. The final one is the geographic cherry picking fallacy. The most common version of this, there are a number of studies, my own included, to this, I hope anyway, but sort of comparing Toronto and Detroit, and particularly on issues of segregation. And a lot of sociologists point out that within the United States, where there's most segregation, there's a segregation index that goes from 0 to 1, 1 being the most segregated, the 0 being the least segregated, that there is a generally a relationship between the size of at least the black-white segregation number and the size of the black community. And there's a couple of different mathematical explanations of this, but also group threat explanations that sort of like in places like Detroit, which moved from, in the span of 50 years, of 10 or 15% black city to an 80% black city, that the toxicity of the response, the intensity of the response by white institutions and people was just greater, and so there were more rigidly segregated forces. And it has a very high segregation number, but in cities like Duluth and Allentown, Pennsylvania, and the United States, they have a low segregation number. People have looked at, there have been a number of studies or Canadian studies that looked at the comparison between Toronto and a very highly segregated place like Cleveland or Detroit, and concluded that, look, the numbers speak for themselves. There's just less segregation here, even though, but if you were to compare Toronto to actually places with a similar size black community, it fits very much in with places like Duluth and Allentown. And so sort of geographic cherry picking is a sort of way to sort of de-emphasize the sort of severity in one place versus another. So I guess the bottom line I want to suggest is sort of there's a number of subtle ways. They don't have the intensity of the Bourdieu or Kant approach to just sort of say this is completely inappropriate, stop talking about it. But there are a number of attempts to sort of like position the United States as a foil in a way that kind of diminishes or discourages kind of further inquiry into the extent to which it does or does not, these kinds of processes occur in Canada or not. And I would say that this is fairly pervasive in Canadian urban studies. And so what are the problems with this? I mean, there's a number of problems with this, I think, that sort of both conceptual and I would also moral. Maybe the most obvious kind of moral issue is that I think that whatever the intent of trying to distinguish, and perhaps it's progressively aspirational to distinguish, the experience of anti-blackness with the experience in Canadian cities, I think it has the fundamental effect of denying the struggle of non-white Canadians, and many who don't buy into these assumptions, who have been trying for years to tell mainstream urban geographers and sociologists that these are very, very serious issues. And some have listened. I don't want to suggest that it's sort of there's a monolith, but to suggest that there is something serious happening in housing, and that we just can't just simply throw our hands up and say that it's just sort of a matter of economics or income or whatever. That there is actual ethno-racial discrimination, and at a minimum, I believe we need to sort of at least listen to that group and to at least try to systematically, as social scientists, just sort of like, okay, this isn't about who cares about the Americans. This is about sort of what happens in Canadian society, and if there is a sense that renting an apartment or getting a mortgage or whatever it is more challenging based on your ethno-racial origin, and many believe this is the case, then we're denying that struggle in a certain sense. I would say that it also, the second problem is that it guides assumptions about what is necessary to gather data. That my colleague Tom Slater at Columbia uses this term agnotology, the production of ignorance, right? That is sort of by saying that it's not that big of a deal here, or doesn't suggest that it doesn't put the same kind of pressure on CMHC, or doesn't on research agendas to sort of see if it does, right? Like to sort of, there's a lack of data that many in housing circles have kind of pointed to for years, but few have kind of followed up on. I'll talk about some reasons why that's difficult in a moment to follow up on. But it kind of reproduces a kind of ignorance of the situation that sort of we don't know. I mean, maybe it is better, maybe it's more tolerant, maybe it's not. But I think that it's worth, at a minimum, asking these questions and gathering data, designing research projects around these particular details. So denies the struggles, guides assumptions. But I would say maybe the most important thing is sort of truth-seeking social scientists is that it's also considerable evidence that we already know of, right? That there is structural anti-blackness in Canadian society. That I think if we're going to make the same leaps from sort of the notion that sort of like, X led to Y in the United States, I think we should at least be open to the possibility that those, the same starting points could have led to, contemporary conditions in Canada. We know a lot of things already. This is not sort of like something I'm inventing, right? Like this is something that scholars, some who are in this room, have identified over the years. We know lots of legal details. We know that there were black-only schools in Canada until 1983, but 1964 in this province. There were racially restricted covenants until 1951. 3 years after they were outlawed in the United States. Similar rates of over-incarceration and carding in a contemporary sense. Economists have found wage and wealth disparities between white and black are greater in Canada than in the United States. Institutionally, we know that some labor unions disallowed black membership into the 1950s. And so I would submit that it's not just simply a matter of sort of how we frame these things. It's just we have considerable circumstantial and historical evidence that we ought to be asking these questions, right? That it isn't something that can be sort of easily dismissed as a kind of an American issue. Okay, I want to talk about a couple, kind of switch gears and sort of like, okay, what do we do with this, right? Like sort of this series of observations, conceptual observations, what do we do with this? And this is where it kind of moves from, I guess, more kind of conceptual to more empirical autocritique. And autocritique, I'd say, in my own sense, that my own work was really kind of trained in graduate school before early in my career as kind of the kind of political economy framework, with very materialist. We sort of studied things like gentrification, sort of interested in the kind of material dimensions of housing, and didn't kind of fully lean into sort of are there differences based on racial identification or apparent racial identification and access to all the things that I've been writing about. So this is kind of an effort, like how do I sort of like take these observations and sort of overcome some of these fallacies, because sometimes they do lead to those conclusions, as I discussed before. Those are sometimes the easy conclusions. How do we overcome them? So, this is my sort of swat at a couple of recent projects I've done at trying to kind of overcome some of these tropes. The first one I want to talk about is, the overcoming the evidence lacking trope. And in some senses, this is the easier kind of logical fallacy to overcome, because it just, in part, just requires being willing to look. But it's also more difficult in the sense that some methods of data gathering on race and racism are very difficult. We know, for example, that surveys are very difficult to get honest answers because of social desirability bias, legality. Like if you ask landlords, questions about the racial bias, they have a legal liability. So there's a lot of incentive to not tell the entire truth. But surveys are generally the least expensive thing, or the thing that academics, at least at my scale anyway, can afford. Audits are much more expensive. So in some sense, it's more difficult. Sometimes it's less difficult. But I do think that there's one less difficult element is just being willing to look. And so I want to share a little bit of research that I've done. And if you're interested in the methodological details that I will completely brush over way too quickly today, it is available early view to Journal of Urban Affairs, and it's an article called Anti-Black Residential Preferences in Toronto. And basically we deployed, basically again, just sort of the idea here was like, okay, let's just sort of start from the assumption, I'll start with the assumption that like maybe some of these methods that we sort of like dismiss as like this would work in like just try it, let's see what happens, and let's see what we come up with. So I suspect the sociologists in the room have heard of Reynolds Farley, or Ren Farley, very nice man, who was at the University of Michigan for years, and he's retired now, but he developed something called the show card method. And this is called the show card method because in the 1970s, when he first deployed this, he literally had show cards. He had sort of people interviewing, had interviewers interviewing respondents, and he would show them these series of show cards. It was a survey design, but he tried to sort of get past social desirability bias by race matching the interviewer with the interviewee, in the sense of sort of like having black interviewer interviewing black respondents, white interviewers white respondents. The idea being to get them to be sort of comfortable, right, being honest about the truth. There's also some sense this particular method that these are a bit more reliable, like sort of really constraining the terms. If you ask sort of broad questions like, do you accept black people into society or something, again, 95% of people would say so. But when you sort of constrain it to sort of like, okay, this is a neighborhood and sort of it's 50-50 black-white, would you feel comfortable on a scale of 1 to, that you can get more honesty or at least more nuance. But all of that said, I think that both he and I and everybody who's done a version of this understand that even in this design, there's probably, tolerance is probably overstated, right? Like that probably in truth, that there's actually a little less tolerant in truth. But we deployed this method basically being these show cards, where sort of like what he would do is sort of like, he would show these show cards to respondents. They would ask them, imagine you live in the house in the center, and in this particular, it was looking at Detroit, it's sort of this very black-white city at the time, sort of houses that are shaded black, it's a black household, there's houses that are shaded white, or a white household. Imagine you live in the center of this, you can Likert scale it, sort of like a scale of 1 to 5, 1 to 10, whatever. How comfortable are you living or visiting this particular neighborhood? Would you buy a house here? And then send some designs to have them rank these neighborhoods. And there have been a number of different applications in the United States and other kinds of cities. So he was doing this in Detroit in the 1970s. It was a much broader attempt to deploy this to 4 cities in the U.S., and I hope we get them right, sort of Detroit, Boston, Atlanta, Los Angeles, which to sort of get more multi-ethnic cities thrown into this, so it's not just sort of like white, what are the kinds of, and so we tried to sort of, create a kind of Toronto adaptation to this, and Toronto being much more like Los Angeles than sort of Detroit in the sense that it's sort of multi-ethnic, but to try to tease some of that out. To what extent is there sort of an effort that is particularly anti-black, or is it just particularly anti-visible minority, or is it just particularly homophilic in the sense that sort of like the desire of immigrant groups to live amongst one's own, can we tease these out? So we created a series of essentially show cards, or digital show cards, I suppose you could say they were. They're basically an internet survey. We got about 2,500 respondents, and we tried to get as much of the racial mix in the respondents as possible. And then tried to record 3 different dimensions of sort of their comfort in different neighborhoods. So we'd ask them to indicate their comfort with buying a house in the center in 3 different scenarios. One is and then the other was we would also, then after that, we'd ask them to rank them. So we felt like we're getting a little more honesty there when we sort of like, everybody could hit, perfectly comfortable on all of these. But when we ask them to rank them, then it's sort of, they're forced to make a choice. You can only have one first place, you can only have one fifth place. And so the first dimension of difference was sort of same difference, sort of like unspecified sort of, the houses that say same is that that's your at the racial identification, whatever that is, whatever you see that is, the rest being different and mixing up the ratio. Sometimes it's 50-50, sometimes it's majority different, sometimes it's majority same. We did the same with white visible minority, the idea being sort of like, if we do detect anti-blackness or particular anti-blackness, is this just sort of part of a general intolerance, right? Like that they're just sort of, they dislike all groups that are non-white. And then the third was more directly comparison to these sort of American models, and that is to sort of the black-white mix. Again, with no specification on we did record the racial background of the respondent, but that was for them to sort of apply in this particular case. So again, comfort and then sort of to rank these in particular cases. And a lot of methodological details, obviously here, too many that are on the screen, which just sort of indicate we found lots of things that sort of interested you. If you're interested in the study, please feel free to download it. I'd love to interact with you if you're. But maybe some summary points that I think were really, really interesting, and particularly when it comes to this notion of kind of compare and contrast with the American experience, that there were a number of things that were quite similar, right? Ren Farley, back in the 1970s, this highly segregated city in Detroit, the Detroit region, found that basically most black respondents preferred, the highest preference neighborhood was the 50-50 black-white neighborhood. That was the highest preference. White respondents were very, very averse to very few numbers of black households in the neighborhood, even in the abstract, even stating that this is probably overstating the level of tolerance using methods like this. So that was actually almost identical, right? Like with this, the black respondents preferred the 50-50 neighborhood, white respondents were more comfortable in much wider environments. Anti-blackness also could not, at least in this design, anti-blackness was greater than the degree of homophily. That is to say, non-black respondents expressed a stronger desire to not live near black people than to live with neighbors of their own ethno-racial origin. And then finally, anti-blackness was stronger than other forms of racial bias. That is, the stated desire to avoid co-residence with black people was higher than the stated avoidance of visible minorities in general. So those are the things that were very similar, some things that are different. That one, which kind of shocked us, is there's much more openness to expressing racial animus among older, wealthier, more educated white respondents. We tend to find that that is where the social desirability bias is stronger, and it's particularly with higher levels of education. But many did not hold back in this study. There were comment boxes that were just sort of almost want to write a paper by itself, just with the comment boxes with this. And then findings that were similar to certain cities in the United States. And I think this, what I'm trying to do here is sort of set up that, like, when it comes to something like racism or racial bias, that there's yes, there are particularisms, but I don't think that sort of you can easily nationalize those in particular ways. Findings that were similar to certain cities in the United States, particularly multicultural ones. One is that other non-white groups, that is, other non-white groups expressed a similar anti-black aversion. East Asian respondents in particular expressed acutely anti-black attitudes about co-residents that were very similar to Camille Zubriski's work in Los Angeles in the early 1990s. So the bottom line, I would say that sort of like why I've sort of raised this sort of in this particular context, and again, brushed over 1,000 details that are really, really important. Happy to interact with anyone who would like to talk more about this particular study. The bottom line to me is that sort of lacking evidence does not mean that it's the same thing as it doesn't exist. And I think that there are particular details of racial animus in the United States, but and we shouldn't deny that, right? But there is also great value in deploying at least some of the methods that have been used to sort of assess this. And sort of, for better or worse, there has been sort of maybe more of a willingness to sort of look at these. And I think that particularly in a society, particularly in places like Toronto and Vancouver, that are becoming much more multi-ethnic, much more non-white than they were a generation ago, I think it's not just important, maybe it's incredibly important to do so today. Okay, so that's overcoming, at least my swipe at overcoming the evidence, lacking the fallacy, my attempt, sort of ongoing attempt to sort of overcome the sort of institutional specificity trope. My sort of parallel life, or sort of is looking at, and maybe I contributed to a lot of this sort of like emphasis, of sort of like emphasizing these details in the United States, and not sufficiently focusing on them in Canada, and so perhaps this is again the outer critique part of this. But as some of you know, I've been in the last 5 to 7 years writing about urban decline in the American Rust Belt in particular, but also with an eye to what we think of as the Canadian Rust Belt, places like London, places like Windsor, Hamilton, that used to be much more manufacturing oriented, but no longer are. And in some of those cases have lost considerable amounts of this book, Manufacturing Decline, was really about sort of trying to assess like what is it associated, especially these highly visible forms of housing abandonment, vast areas that used to have a house on every parcel of Detroit and Cleveland and no longer do, or only have a few, and even the few that are there are, half of them are vacant. What is most associated with that? And other attempts, sort of ongoing attempts in parallel to this, to sort of ask why we do or do not have those kinds of same sorts of things in Canada. And the sort of temptation, I guess, is sort of to go down to institutional specificity, that there are a number of very important differences that I think could be used to sort of dismiss or make a sort of broader point that I'm trying to sort of avoid making, and we'll sort of talk about, circle back to that in a second. So maybe just a bit of backdrop of sort of what the sort of item, the institutional item I'm talking about in the United States. Some of you, if you've been to Detroit outside of the downtown area, if you've been on the east side of Cleveland, the east side of Buffalo, you may have driven through or visited friends or whatever that live in neighborhoods like this, but they're very, very different than much of even struggling cities in Canada, that in the sense that there are vast sections of all of those Rust Belt cities in the United States that contain what I have deemed extreme housing loss neighborhoods, and these are places that have where the majority of houses are missing, right? Like they used to be there in the 1950s, 1960s. They've been demolished, abandoned first, then demolished, often with sort of arson or scrapping damage in the middle. And then there's vast areas that are essentially just open fields now, where they were every bit as urban as where the University of Toronto is in Toronto, that sort of right downtown, that close to the center of the city in Detroit. There are these extreme housing loss neighborhoods. And what I've sought to do through a couple of empirical mechanisms is sort of what are those associated with? What's the prevalence of these extreme housing loss neighborhoods? Can we operationalize this in some sense? And what is it most associated with? And so I've just chosen a basic metric of sort of 1970 to 2010. The census tracts that have lost more than half of their housing in that time period. And there were about 280 of these census tracts throughout the American Rust Belt, but they were highly variable, right? Like they were highly variable. Some cities like Detroit have dozens of these. Some cities have a single extreme housing loss neighborhood. Many cities don't have any at all, and some cities have somewhere between. So you have this sort of scalable variable to sort of like what else is associated with those spaces, with those regions, with those cities that might help explain the prevalence, the concentration of these. And most conversations of this sort in the urban decline literature say, it's just manufacturing job loss. That's why you're even bothering with this question. But the truth is that's a very inefficient mechanism. All of these places have lost considerable, very similar levels of manufacturing jobs. Not all of them have the same level of extreme housing loss neighborhood. So my task in sort of in the book and sort of recent work was sort of like, okay, what is it explained? And I sort of came up with this sort of like cobbled together theory of just sort of a variety of levels of anti-blackness that are facilitating through a number of different modalities, facilitating the abandonment of certain neighborhoods. And the primary factor to which all of this is attached is the size of the black community at the beginning of that time period, 1970, in places where that community was sizable. There was the greatest degree of destruction. In places where it was minimal, small, there was less. And so, what was the theory based on? Sort of a couple of different modalities. Why would there be an association between the presence of black populations and urban decline? Well, there's a couple of things that I sort of try to argue in the book, and one is that that these are the places that, going back to Massey and Denton, that these are the places sort of prior to 1970s. When housing discrimination was legal, where there was essentially an American apartheid, that black families were forced to live, often after the Great Migration, forced to live in one or two neighborhoods in a particular city. If they ventured, whether they were a doctor or just a sort of regular, a laborer, they were forced to live in one particular place. Those particular places were targeted under urban renewal, often in the case of Detroit, completely wiped off the face of the map. This led to what Mindy Fullilove talks about as sort of root shock, which is sort of instability that is overly concentrated in a racial way. White resistance to co-residence. This is really the point of the Ren Farley in our work on those neighborhood preference surveys, is if you finding a systematic desire of a particular ethnic racial group, particularly if it's the majority and the group that has the greatest access to mortgage capital, white people, when the white people are still the majority in every metropolitan region in the American Rust Belt, if that group has decided for one reason or another that they're unwilling to live in even the most marginally integrated neighborhoods, and sociologists continue to find that continues to today, that it almost by definition collapses demand for housing in those particular locations. Places like Detroit and places that had a fairly large black middle class were able to sort of keep their head somewhat above the water into the 1970s and 1980s. But as the black sort of Great Migration turned into the reverse Great Migration, the supply of black households willing to live and buy houses from other black households in these black majority neighborhoods fell off, and there we see a sort of a destruction, a domicile of housing in places that are very particularly focused. The political redlining, political scientists have written about the so-called hollow prize model of how, in particular, again, it's highly variable across the U.S., how very highly varied there was the kind of black municipal empowerment. In some places were remained very small black majorities. Many towns like near where I grew up in Ohio, there were actually very openly racist attempts to push black people or any non-white people who tried to move into various towns out by sheriffs and various KKK. There's a variety. So some places remained very white even well into after the Great Migration. Some places became significantly, in many cases, majority black. Cleveland, Gary, Detroit, and in those places, political scientists have pointed out that there's always a tension between City Hall and the businesses that are located in the city or in the suburbs and sometimes the state capital, but that level of tension reached toxic levels when those city halls started to become represented by black mayors like Coleman Young in Detroit. And there was both an organization, an animus, a toxicity to that manifests in a number of ways that made it very difficult for those places to turn around. In particular, you can't do any economic development policy without the help of the state in the U.S., just same as here with the province and the feds. But the location of new factories and plants and businesses, whatever, were increasingly in places that remained very white and fairly conservative, and were very difficult for places like Detroit to kind of reinvent itself. So there was a kind of political redlining in the city that had material impacts that was particularly acute in places that were actually electing black mayors and city council people. Ongoing employment and housing discrimination. I think that we know from audit studies that employment and housing discrimination still occurs in a variety of different senses. And in cities where there's 5% of the population is black, that discrimination is of course incredibly unfair to the people who have to face it. But it's not super economically impactful because it only applies to 5% of the population of the city. If you take a place like Detroit, which is 80% black, a place like Cleveland that's 50% black, Buffalo 30-35% black, it has a fundamental material impact on tax revenue, on well-being, on material stability of an entire city. And this is, again, why there's such an acute and over version of the sort of extreme housing loss neighborhoods. That this employment, the application effect of it is much greater based on the size of the population. And then finally, targeted policing and over-incarceration. That there are a number, particularly the war on drugs in the 1970s and 1980s, which was fought very differently than the sort of kind of mild war on drugs when those drugs became opioids and were primarily white drugs, as they have been in the last 20 years, was very different than the efforts of sort of eradicating crack cocaine in cities that destroyed not only kind of over-incarcerated, but also in a very targeted way that sort of made it very difficult for people when they return home to the neighborhood where they came from to get a regular job, to find decent housing. So the question is sort of like, okay, this is at least my sense of sort of why we get such an overconcentration of this in the United States, extreme housing loss neighborhoods. And because I'm a dark social scientist, I look for these things everywhere, extreme housing loss neighborhoods, and haven't found a single one in all of Southern Ontario. Obvious signs of post-industrial stress. I don't want to suggest that it's sort of some panacea here, but there is not, to my knowledge, an extreme housing loss neighborhood that emerged between 71 and 2011, the comparable period. And so the easy conclusion, I would say, is sort of like, well, the reason that is all the intensity of all of that, those five modalities that I talked about, wasn't here, right? As Goldberg and Mercer and others argue, it's just a more tolerant society we may have had versions of this that just didn't sort of apply in the same particular case. The other explanation is that, well, we didn't have the same level of deindustrialization, which is manifestly not true, right? Like, we lost tons of manufacturing jobs during the comparable time period. And so my thing is just sort of like, okay, let's pause for a moment and sort of try to think about the flexibility of racism, sort of how, and the application of racism. And I think that one of the things that sort of, the apparatus that I'm setting up in the United States sort of requires sort of large populations and black migrants coming from mostly the American South, and having a very toxic reaction by police forces, by political figures to their very presence. It's something that sociologists call group threat theory, right? That sort of the greater the threat to political power, the greater the threat to material power, the more toxic the response, the more sort of acute the response when it comes to schooling, residence, all these sorts of things. It's also that there's a kind of a group application effect that I'll talk about in a second. That's sort of like in places that were 80% black, if this is the most acute form of racism that we're sort of or this form generates extreme housing loss neighborhoods, then we need to sort of have some sort of broader material kind of dimension. And in places that were 80% black were had a different application effect than sort of say a place that was sort of like marginally black, or 1% or 2% black. And so the easy conclusion, again, would be some of the things that are just expressed. But again, going one step further to sort of like, why didn't the same thing happen on this side of the border? We were essentially an integrated manufacturing belt in some sense, or at least were at one point. Why didn't that happen? Well, I think that to me, the easy answer would be sort of the level of Thomas. The more difficult answer to swallow is that there was such a systematic attempt to deny access to the country to all non-white people, but black people, I would say in particular, because it was sort of a variety, through our immigration system, and sort of beliefs that were openly discussed in the 1950s, and even after the immigration changes were made in 1967, that were discussed. And the net effect of this was that there were forms of housing discrimination, of educational discrimination, that were every bit as mean-spirited and unfair to the individuals they faced. But I would say that the two things that were very different, that they didn't sort of manifest in this sort of like this series of institutions and modalities that I described in the American Rust Belt, were two impacts. Again, group threat and group application, which were both limited based on immigration policy. So group threat, there was, in cases like, we look at those examples I keep bringing up, Buffalo 30%, Cleveland 50%, Detroit 80%. To my knowledge, I think the highest percentage of black population in Canada, at least, was Ajax. I think at one point was in the teens. I think Brampton is probably inching up in certain levels, but there's nothing approximating this in size. And even with that, the sort of black community, to the extent that we want to use that phrase in Canada, is much more divided by language, by ethnicity, by national origin, by religion, than at least the black community circa 1970s in say, Detroit, which were almost all coming from the same region of the American South, spoke the same language, worshiped the same God, and so there was a sort of like a common response to a common perceived threat. In this case, there's much more variation that occurs. So you don't have the same kind of like, it's difficult to use that paradigm because there was not the sort of same kind of impurity. Well, but more than that, to the extent that we can sort of group black peoples into sort of a sort of statistical category, that there isn't the same group application of that. So if we say that in Detroit, every black person, every black family is facing housing discrimination or mortgage discrimination, whether they're rich or poor, whatever, and that's 80% of the city, that's a huge application that's sort of going to impact. There were much smaller, much less coverage in terms of this, and I think that maybe the common, the sort of long and the short of it, I think it's just sort of like, yes, it is maybe comforting, maybe it's easier, I suppose, to come to the conclusion that sort of extreme housing loss neighborhoods, or in particular from redlining, doesn't exist, that we sort of make the easy conclusion that there are other things that don't exist, or there are other kind of forms of animus that don't exist. But I think that it may be better to sort of like try to overcome this sort of evidence lacking in institutional specificity fallacy and move to a model that listens more than sort of states these kind of generalizations. So, okay, so I see we're nearing the end of my 45 minutes, and the department's starting to inch around in his chair, so I will finish up with a few comments. The first of which is just sort of, maybe just as a bit of a side note, and talk has gone through various versions as I kind of wrote it, we didn't talk as much about geographical contingency as we could in the Q&A period, but I would say that there's considerable variation within and between American and Canadian cities. And as a side note, if I were to rewrite or make a mission to rewrite the Goldberg and Mercer piece, which they probably never asked me to do, I would make it a two-part collection. One being the volume one being the myth of the Canadian city, the volume two being the myth of the American city. The idea being that I think that there's considerable regional variation within both countries and across the border between regions that sort of make things very difficult to sort of refer to national models or certainly continental models in that way. We can talk more about that in the Q&A if you'd like, but I would say more generally that I think inter-urban comparisons can be valuable or problematic, but that the details of such a comparison are what make them one or the other. If we focus on particular forces like anti-Black racism, we can identify so much variation that it is possible to suggest that what has been observed in, say, Detroit in 1965 does not appear in Toronto in 2024, or even Cleveland in 1966, which would be a much closer comparison. Every form of racism has its particular characteristics, and no one should deny that. But when we use this heuristic to suggest that because some superficial differences exist, anti-Black racism itself is not present, I believe we make a problematic leap. Make no mistake, there's arguably no force as impactful to the shape, opportunity, or politics in American cities as anti-Black racism. But the presence of something in the United States does not therefore make the opposite true in Canada or elsewhere in the non-American global north. Canadian cities, particularly like Toronto and Vancouver, have become considerably more diverse since 1967. My own view is that the social sciences should embrace this fact and seek to understand this reality better, rather than using the United States as a foil to suggest that racism doesn't exist or that it's much more marginal. I think that we should listen to non-white Canadians who feel marginalized. The academic theory and methodologies exist. Much of the remaining impediment is simply the willingness to look. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hackworth. We got, you put a lot of issues on the table, and so I'm sure there's lots of questions. Do you want to just moderate your own discussion, or do you want me to do something?
Unless people start throwing things at me, I think it's fine.
I'll launch in, and a little bit of this is personal for me. I grew up in Oshawa, but my family has roots in Scarborough. And as you were closing out here, actually, and not finding extreme housing loss neighborhoods in Canada, I'm going to pose an interesting question to you of perhaps why this doesn't show up in Canada within the data. And again, this might be a fallacy here, is that there's a bit of an immigration replacement effect that was going on in the 80s, and that there was considerable white flight out of Scarborough as Durham Region was built out. And now there's even evidence that there's white flight occurring out of the east edge of Durham Region into the further Clarington area. And that we're not seeing extreme housing loss like was in the United States because the federal government is maintaining immigration levels high enough that that demand and supply of housing is met by the demand of migrants moving in and self-selecting into those neighborhoods. And I mean, I think there might be a comparable on the west side of Toronto too with Brampton. And the fact that, for a very long time that was a predominantly white city council with a new migrant community that kept moving in but didn't have that political representation.
No, I completely hear you, and I think that in some ways there's a analog with even Detroit. I think that the Great Migration was still occurring in the 1970s, and there were houses were sellable, right, to people who were willing to live in those locations. There was kind of a demand created that way. It wasn't just the GTA. It was looking, I guess, and I see that Toronto's very complicated. GTA is very complicated because that's not just, as Canada opens up, such a high percentage of immigrants go to the GTA, and so it's difficult to kind of it's not its own island. It's sort of separated. But it's also the case, and there's lots of places that are more distressed in sort of manufacturing, or sort of in the popular places like Sudbury, places like Timmins, places like Thunder Bay also don't have at least the same, and they don't have nearly the sort of immigrant inputs as you're suggesting. So mean, I do think a lot of it, in the US, I mean, I get into it in the book about just sort of like, there are some differences. Again, the extent to which those are sort of rooted in themselves kind of issues of racial division. I think in the States, I think that, you know, metropolitan areas are so much more fragmented in the United States, the way they finance schools, that there is a kind of like, what's the A.O. Hirschman exit voice loyalty, that sort of exit. That is the sort of approach to all American policy, and sort of like that if you are middle class, it's not only that you're sort of, that as fragmented as the GTA is, it pales in comparison to sort of like, that it has basically, they've used not only municipal boundaries as kind of moats in a sense, that sort of like people move, but then there's not, then it sort of like deteriorates. You know, Detroit itself has kind of deteriorated when its suburbs have actually thrived, in some part because they've been able to separate the kind of social responsibilities entirely. And I will say that for all of the complaints about sort of amalgamation, or whatever, like Ontario and Canada in general has done a much better job. I use a slide in my class about the comparison between American cities and just sort of the, I don't get the numbers a little bit off here, but they're sort of, you compare Buffalo, Cleveland, and Detroit, they're somewhere in the sort of 15 to 20%, the city itself, of their metropolitan area. So that's the city of Buffalo, about 15% of its overall metropolitan area. You compare it to even places that are, you know, kind of struggling a bit, Winnipeg being a bit, it's nearly 100%. The Ottawa's quite large. Toronto, which is pretty hemmed in, is 50%, right, of its metropolitan area. And that matters enormously in terms of tax base. In American environments, the primary axis of sort of isolating has been the use of municipal boundaries and school boundaries. So there are a number of institutional differences, absolutely, and I do think that the inputs, but even in those places that have experienced deindustrialization and don't have the same kind of immigrant inflows, to my knowledge anyway, at least, they've not been an extreme housing loss neighborhood that I know. That's a pretty high threshold. 50% of the housing gone is pretty high. So, and there's certainly some, probably here in London, that have lost substantial, but perhaps not at that threshold level.
I mean, one of the other things that I'll quibble with, particularly about Northern Ontario and to this region to a certain extent, is that there's been a considerable amount of rural depopulation within rural areas, and that it may not show up because the town ceased to exist in 1960 when the resource economy collapsed. So.
Yeah, there were some, some of the, you're right, places, Timmins is struggling, places surrounding Timmins are struggling.
Yeah. And people would just move into Timmins because the housing was available cheap.
I'm going to ask that methodological question. What was, sorry, someone, just to follow up, what, can you remind me what was the dates that you looked at the from to for extreme housing loss, and what was your unit of analysis?
Census tract, and it was 1970 to 2010.
Okay.
So there were some we tried to find them in the U.S., in Canada as well. There were some and they very well could exist, but we were struggling with a couple things, boundary issues, places that weren't even tracked in 1971, which sort of like that sort of eliminates, and you're probably right, these small towns that are adjacent to Sudbury or Thunder Bay that are probably losing almost all of their population.
But thinking bigger though, what about like, you know, the Ville Marie Expressway being built in the 1970s, and surely there was extreme housing loss.
We tried to eliminate those that were part of redevelopments. We wanted to try to identify more or less organic loss, right? Like sort of like that just sort of people left, not that a freeway or an airport. Or
Of course, those were very political, and
yes,
those
of course,
were
yes.
slum clearance, sort of.
Yes, and not to diminish those at all. I guess we were just sort of seeking, you know, given the variation in those in the U.S., like where just in the ones that were just fully residential neighborhood, there wasn't a wrecking ball per se, it was just sort of people abandoning, then getting scrapped or having arson damage, then going through a tax foreclosure process, then being eventually demolished. There are hundreds of those cases, and we weren't able to find one exactly like that, but they may exist, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think in Montreal and those areas that are around the expressway are now extreme housing gain neighborhoods that were fallow from the 90s. They were empty, and now like tens of thousands of people are in them now because of the need for downtown housing.
With the kind of study period terminating in 2010, I'm just wondering if you considered the effect of the foreclosure crisis in the U.S. and, you know, if would your results be similar if you had ended at 2006, right? Or was there, you know, in terms of the neighborhood loss particularly, because my understanding is the foreclosure crisis was more severe in the U.S. than it was in Canada.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it accelerated, I think, trends. It's something I actually am doing this summer, as I start thinking about my summer research projects, and one is just trying to isolate the impact of 2010 to 2020, and in particular to match whatever census data with purchasing data, because I think what's happened is a lot of these locations, and again, people use, I'm sure, certain comparisons between like Toronto and Detroit, but even like Niagara Falls, Ontario, and New York are just sort of like huge cost differences. That there, in Detroit, prior to the crash, there were many neighborhoods, sort of like 2-bedroom houses where it would go for like $60,000-$80,000. You still had some bank interest where you could go through like a conventional mortgage and sort of like, after the crash, those would go to literally $500. I mean, there were sort of houses, which make it almost impossible to go through like a conventional sale. It's harder if you can afford that as a payment, right? Like on $1,000 house or whatever, it has a lot of damage, but you can't get a realtor you can't get an appraiser, you can't get a mortgage for it or whatever. So it was basically only cash-only buyers, basically, in a lot of these locations, 2010 to 2020. And I think we're going to find that sort of like that there's going to be a positive relationship between the presence of these folks and the continued destruction, right? Like the places that, not from 70 to 2010, but just 2010 to 2020, the amount of loss, because so many of those cash-only buyers themselves people were buying things off of eBay, and they weren't necessarily like experienced. They just thought they could get rich quick. Like, why couldn't you? Like a lot of them are Canadians actually, which was sort of like these house prices were just so low. Of course, I'd be able to make money off of that. And a lot of those went back into foreclosure and demolition. Like there was an accelerated destruction based on sort of these cash-only purchases. So yes, it's in the works. This started, I guess I started thinking about this in the sort of 2013, 12, whatever, when the best census data, at least the normalized tracks, I don't know where the American census, there were a number of products that came out that normalize the census tract boundaries for like the first time in the early 2000s, and that's mostly laziness that using that, but I hope to do something subsequent to that.
Have you looked at the justifications that people provide for the housing segregation study you did?
Oh, the preference.
Yeah, the preference. So are there Canadian-American differences just in how we justify our biases?
I don't know. I mean, I don't have access to, I don't know if, I want to get access to, so there was I haven't seen the longer justification. I read all of the Ren Farley studies and sort of to create a baseline, but they did a much more publicly available version that I'm trying to, it's in some strange database format that I'm trying to get access to for the summer, that I think may have some of it in the early 1990s, but that I don't know what the reasons that were given at the time. I can say that there was, and I suppose you probably get these in your surveys as well, it's just sort of like, there was a lot of anger at even just asking the question. I mean, I think that was the thing that jumped out to me the most, and most of it skewed fairly white and older, that they were just sort of offended that I would even ask, and and that's honestly the thing that came through the most in the comment section, which is like, how dare you? Like just even, and some I think would just sort of like try to proxy it, I would say, and sort of said like, you're asking these questions, but that's not the reason I come out this way, but it's a proxy for something else, it's for the neighborhood condition or whatever. But I don't also have I suspect that we have a similar series of justifications in the American studies in the 90s. There's Maria Kreisand in Chicago has done a lot of these kind of versions of this, but I don't have access to their notes, so I'm not sure what the excuses were used in the 70s in Chicago or whatever. So
I just think Canadians may have more justifications, more layered justifications.
Yeah.
For, yeah.
Yeah.
Why
I mean,
we
I think my sense is, I thought they were going to, yeah, I'm glad, I don't know, I'm sort of checking over my shoulder after sending the survey, the venom struck me as sort of like, why are you, yeah, that was the thing, that was not sort of much of an effort. There were some that, like I said, seemed like on the precipice of trying to come up with more intricate excuses, but I think mostly it was just sort of like, why are you doing this?
But if you ask them for their justifications, you might get more.
Yeah, it's true, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Anyways.
I'd have to have a class poll between some of the same categories. In 2 separate rooms, maybe Zoom.
Okay, maybe I should have figured out how to phrase this before I asked the question, but one thing that I was kind of curious about is your decision to focus in the Canadian context on anti-black racism in particular. I'm not saying that's not a valuable thing to do, but sometimes when I think about sort of from my own perspective as somebody who's not really an expert on these things, the ways in which I conceptualize perhaps differences between the dynamics of racism in Canadian and American cities. In Canadian cities, different kinds of racisms and racial prejudices come to mind for me as well, including against Indigenous people, who are a significant urban presence, of course, in many Canadian cities, and also against other ethnic and racial groups. So is there, from what you know in the Canadian context, would you say there is something distinctive about anti-black racism as opposed to other kinds of, and if not, why focus on that specifically in the Canadian context?
I don't know that, I think that, and again, I wouldn't say distinctive because I don't think that it's unusual. I think the Bourdieu and Wakanda article actually sort of illustrate, I think there are other societies, France, that I think is much more in denial of even just having a conversation about it. But I would say if there's something distinctive or different than the US, I think there's an intense conversation. Like I've given lectures in the States in the last couple of years, and I've actually asked my hosts, like, we can talk about something else, because I don't think, I'm really worried they're going to get funding cut just to even have conversations like this. So it's not like there's embrace of this in the US. I don't want to suggest that, but I think that it's seen as a battle. I think that there's a kind of denial of its presence. I certainly don't want to diminish. I absolutely agree that there are other forms of racism. I don't want to diminish or even discuss this as the only, maybe even the most important. I think it's some of this all just boils down to background and my own kind of background, both from an undergraduate degrees and just my background in reading Black literature, Black radical tradition, and then coming here and just sort of kind of being absent and kind of stumbling across versions of this 10 or 15 years ago, reading Robin Wink's book, which is sort of mind-breaking for me in some ways. Robin Wink's is sort of the book Blacks in Canada, which is problematic. There's a number of things that's not perfect about that book, but just sort of, I guess I just sort of casually lived in this society for maybe 10 years and just sort of assumed maybe it is different. I don't know. I didn't really give much thought or whatever, and then started thinking about, the number of identical elements. Why are we talking about it? It may not be the only thing. I do feel like we're certainly, no one should be getting a trophy for sort of Canada's treatment of Indigenous people or Chinese people. I observed there was at least a conversation happening sort of at various levels about sort of, that was almost nothing about this particular, perhaps because it's a small group. I don't know, but most of it just stems from personal interest and just sort of like, this is an interesting story that I feel like needs some more highlight, and that the contrast is sort of used to, if there is a connection to those other kinds of racisms, I do think that there's the contrast, or the sort of putative contrast between the American and Canadian experience on anti-Black racism. I think it does get used to kind of put a wet blanket on conversations about other, it's sort of like just more tolerant. Shut up, like, this isn't, why do you have to raise these divisive questions or whatever? And that, not just as it applies to Black people, but also to other non-white people, to Indigenous people. I do think that there's some connection there, but to be honest, part of it is just personal interest and background, and that this I found it interesting, like under-discussed, under-researched issue in Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to be clear, I wasn't questioning your
sure.
choice. I was just curious about sort of the contextualization. John?
I guess something came up in, I'm sorry, did I cut someone off? Okay, I'm sorry. Something that's come up in Professor Martin's courses, we were talking a little bit about the study of racism in the urban environment, and the way that Canada measures race is differently than the United States. In the United States, we've got white, we've got Black, we've got Hispanic, and we've got other. And then in Canada, we've got some very different categorizations of ways we go about it, and generally, when we look at the census, it's visible minority, always like one kind of big pile, and they have the breakdowns, but these are kind of like the categories as they're presented. Do you find that posed challenges in your comparison between the U.S. and Canada, and looking at the United
Yeah, I mean, I've always been an advocate of, I mean, I think both are changing, actually, right now. I do think that there's much more parsimony in the US Census now than there used to be. But you're right, at one point it was black and other. It wasn't even sort of, it was just sort of, yeah, I mean, I guess I've always, whatever the application, and in this study, we did try to break it down at least to the StatsCan versions, which I think are actually too broad to begin with. I don't know what East Asian is not a common experience. It's multiple countries, there's several languages, there's sort of South Asia the same, and so like sort of that while it's a bit more parsed, but it has, I mean, Canada has, there was, I'm slipping, somebody wrote about this in the early 1990s, that this Canadian census was missing a substantial portion of what would now be sort of grouped under black, because it was sort of, there was some way that nationality was trumping it, and the sort of, I don't know if anyone knows who can speak more to that, but there definitely are differences, but I never found the lack, I mean, I don't think it's like a condition like it is in France, where I feel like they just simply won't gather data on race, that there's almost a stubbornness. I think that the latest census is the first time they've tried, but a lot that sentiment that was expressed by Wakanda Purdue, that like racism doesn't exist in this society, and we're going to prove that by not gathering any information or whatever. That yeah, there are differences between the U.S. and Canadian census, but I didn't find, at least on that level, there to be that difficult to make the comparison. It's just a much smaller community, and it's much more varied today. I would say that the American black community is becoming very highly varied as well, because it's mostly new immigrants who are also defined by language, religion, and these kinds of things. But it wasn't empirically that difficult at all.
So just to add into his question, basically, like in Canada, we have different definition of ethnicity, the visible minority. So at any point you noticed, out of the overall visible minority when you were focusing on the black individuals, any other minority, or you notice there is a significant shift during this, the racism or the housing situation? Anything that was like more like a surprising thing?
Well, like I said, the willingness to, I found there was a big age divide, which I guess maybe shouldn't be so surprising, I guess, but sort of when it came to sort of suspected social desirability bias and sort of angering comments about why you're asking this, whatever, those skewed fairly old, and that, and also kind of fairly prejudicial comments about sort of like non-white people in neighborhoods, and that there was much greater levels of sort of this is just a survey of sort of like perceived desired neighborhood diversity. That younger people were notably different. That was one of the, we basically tried to define, I can't remember how we operationalized sort of the most sort of anti-black stated preferences, and those that sort of just do a basic chi-square, like where the big breaks. And age was a very big one. Something else that I went, we're following up on this study. We actually were able to get postal code information from anyone who was willing to provide it. In the summer, we're going to follow up with actual like stated differences between their stated neighborhood and their actual neighborhood. So it's sort of like to see where there's actual, whereas I suppose it could be a study on social desirability bias, but it would also be sort of aspirational. And what the thing we were finding is that the people who have the greatest desire to to move anywhere they want live in the most monolithically white environments and whatever. That sort of, so it'll be. I'm sort of curious. We're in the process of analyzing right now to sort of compare the sort of like on any of those three counts, sort of same, other, or black, white, or visible minority, non-visible minority, whose actual neighborhood is most different from their aspirational neighborhood, and to see if we can kind of strip it down.
Sorry, I'll go back to the extreme housing loss. I'm also wondering, did you correct for like the cottage effect in the data, like looking at primary residence versus non?
We were just housing, I guess, you would think that would add or subtract?
Well, I'm thinking of, like, obviously there's units, but they're owned by someone who's only there 3 weeks out of the year on the weekends.
It was just the physical destruction of the units, so whether they were occupied or not is not the question, and we're looking for places of loss. I suppose in those cases, it would, if anything, be gain, wouldn't they, or do you have something?
Well, so what I'm getting at there is that the loss would have been masked by the fact that people are buying those up as vacation properties. And so it still looks like that housing exists, but it's actually not, there's no population there on a regular basis.
The reason that it was just the physical destruction unit, and the reason we use that is just sort of, in the realm of urban decline studies, there's a great deal of reliance on population, which is highly, household sizes, all kinds of things are sort of affecting, and you can get 4 and 5% population change. That we felt like physical destruction of a house is evidence of pretty deep form of decline, people walking away from a primary investment. It's also very likely to maintain itself. It's very expensive to build a house on a parcel of land. It costs $200,000 or $300,000 today in North America to build a house to code, and that's very unlikely in a place where the ambient house value is $20,000. It's very unlikely that that's going to sort of return. And it's also very visible. I guess that's sort of the idea with that is just sort of like the visibility. This is sort of like the most extreme form of urban decline that we can think of, and the most organic. So it's not just sort of like one single development, an expressway or whatever. So that was the idea. It probably misses some things, but I think that at a minimum, I don't think that if it does exist, if there are examples that we've missed, we don't know of a way to, if you have an idea of a way to sort of find them, that would be interesting, because I think we were struggling with some boundary issues as well, which I think were the main problems. It's sort of like the 71 boundaries, they were a bit more evenly cut than the American census, but it was still difficult in some cases. So there was also not the same association, because there was so much less variation at the starting point. Canada was still a very monolithically white place in 1971, and so finding sort of like, this kind of live field experiment of like, this place is ethno-racial AA and this place is ethno-racial B, let's look at it through time. Most places were of a particular, so you wouldn't get the same. My attempt was just simply to move beyond it, like sort of like, okay, if we don't have that, then what does that mean? And then it's more of a matter of interpretations.
I mean, really what I'm trying to get at is that perhaps because of our immigration policies, in which they didn't really liberalize until the late 80s, that this is predominantly a function of class in the time period that you're looking at, and that the process itself is fundamentally different than it was in the United States, in that there was not that racial context present at the start of looking at those neighborhoods, but that the class itself, it very much is perpetuating urban-rural divides, as well as those who have high income, high education versus those with low income, low education.
It could. I don't, again, outside of the GTA, I think is sort of, I don't know. I'd have to think more about that. It's definitely the case that the starting point was very different. I do think that the ongoing point is maybe a bit more similar. I do think that but I know I'd have to think more about that.
Okay. I think, oh yes, we're at 3:30. So thank you everybody for coming, and thank you very much, Dr. Hackworth.